The mighty Douglas fir tree is truly the king of the lowland forests of southwestern British Columbia, towering over the undergrowth that lies beneath it. But wait, all the organisms in an ecosystem are mutually interdependent, so metaphors of kingship don't make much sense here. Murray Bookchin argues that we make a mistake when we import notions of hierarchy from the social world and apply them to the natural world. Ecologically speaking, it doesn't make much sense to talk about hierarchy. But Bookchin takes this thought one step further. If it doesn't make much sense to talk about hierarchy in the natural world, then maybe it doesn't make much sense to think hierarchically in human societies either.
There's a scene toward the beginning of The Lion King. This is the smash hit 1994 Disney animated film that was later turned into a smash hit Broadway musical that was later turned into a smash hit live action film with lots of spin-offs and so on and so forth, in which the Lion King Mufasa takes his young son Simba up onto a ridge to survey the lands that will one day be Simba's to rule over. And Mufasa explains to Simba that with kingship comes great responsibility for all the life and all the animals that live under his power. And Simba asks the quite reasonable question. He says, "But don't we lions eat antelopes?" And Mufasa says, "Yes, but the antelopes eat the grass, and when we die, our bodies will feed the grass. And so we're all a part of this beautiful circle of life." And then we get into a nice song about the circle of life. What's left unexplained is why this circle of life needs the executive authority of a bunch of lions in order to supervise it, let alone why hereditary kingship is the appropriate form of political organization for supervising this circle of life, or why, if all of the animals in this ecosystem are a part of this beautiful circle of life, why the hyenas come in for such a bad rap. Murray Bookchin points out that this tendency to import ideas of hierarchy from human societies into our thinking about ecosystems is hardly unique to Disney films. He doesn't mention Disney films, but he does point out that we do talk about lions as the proverbial kings of the jungle, not to mention talking about ant and bee colonies being overseen by queens, even though those queens' functions is exclusively reproductive rather than executive or supervisory. And Bookchin argues that if we look at ecosystems more clearly, we'll see that they aren't structured hierarchically, but are structured in a web-like form. There's a food web, to borrow a phrase made popular by Charles Elton, which is very much like Mufasa and Simba's circle of life. But if you have a circle of life where everything is interdependent and interconnected, it no longer really makes sense to talk about kings or queens or workers or slaves or any kind of hierarchy at all. According to Bookchin, an ecosystem is what he calls a dynamic unity of diversity. So on one hand, it's important to recognize the unity of an ecosystem tied together in a food web, that all of the parts of an ecosystem are dependent upon one another. But that wholeness, that unity, essentially relies on diversity, that it's only because there are so many different elements in an ecosystem that are feeding off one another that the ecosystem as a whole can remain healthy and retains its integrity. And Bookchin thinks, on one hand, this incredible complexity of ecosystems makes it very hard to exercise any conscious or deliberate control over. And what's more, if we eradicate the diversity in an attempt to control it, we end up doing great damage to the ecosystem. And he sees that, for instance, happening in a lot of monoculture agriculture, where people try to eradicate the ecological complexity of a landscape and plant it with just a single crop or a small number of crops. And it's in these monocultures, for instance, that pests start to become really dangerous, because when there's only one thing to feed on, the whole complexity of an ecosystem where one thing feeds on another, feeds on another, feeds on another, collapses in a way that the ecosystem as a whole can suddenly come under threat. As with nature, so with society. So Bookchin thinks it's a mistake to think hierarchically about the way that ecosystems are organized. And he also thinks that we are doing harm to the ecosystem when we try to impose some kind of control on it that reduces its natural diversity and complexity. And he thinks similar things about human society, that human societies best flourish when they aren't organized hierarchically and when there isn't any kind of top-down control that reduces the natural diversity and complexity of human forms of association. And this connection between ecology on the one hand and society on the other is at the heart of Bookchin's theory of social ecology, in which he envisions societies that are built in small, localized communities that are highly democratic, highly participatory, and non-hierarchical, and where people work communally together in various forms of sustainable agriculture, where they live harmoniously with the land. Now, Bookchin's social ecology draws on a tradition of anarchist thought that has its roots in 19th century thinkers like Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and Mikhail Bakunin and Peter Kropotkin. And this is a leftist political tradition, but a leftist political tradition that's often at odds with communism and socialism, which often envision a stronger role for the state in directing human affairs. This idea of thinking about society and ecology in tandem raises some interesting questions about how far we're supposed to see society and nature as related or distinct. And here Bookchin wants to find a middle ground between two extremes that he doesn't like. So on one extreme, you have the mainstream tradition of Western philosophy of thinking of human beings and human society as radically distinct from and apart from the rest of nature, that we build these civilizations to be apart from nature, that the human mind, the intellect, is somehow something that is radically distinct from all other natural forms. But on the other hand, he wants to avoid thinking about human society as just one more ecosystem, so that we can simply reduce our thinking about human society to thinking about ecology. And this is a mistake he thinks that the Chicago School of Sociology from the early 20th century makes, as well as sociobiologists like E.O. Wilson. Instead, he wants to see society as emerging from nature. So distinct from it in the sense that there are certain forms in human societies that you don't find anywhere else in nature. There are structured institutions. There is the reflexive, self-conscious human knower. But he wants us to see these things as coming out of natural forms, not setting us apart from nature, but rather being a form in which nature itself finds a particular kind of expression. I think there are also some interesting questions about how far this analogy between ecology and society is supposed to go. So, for example, it seems to be, as far as Bookchin is concerned, and I think he's right here, a matter of ecological fact that ecosystems are not structured hierarchically, that there is this food web that means that all things are related to one another. But it's not simply a matter of social fact that human societies aren't structured hierarchically. So there seems to be an attempt to take the factual description of natural ecosystems and apply it in a prescriptive way to human societies, to say something about how ecosystems are and apply that to a claim about how human societies ought to be. And I think there is, as always in philosophy, an interesting question about whether you can derive this kind of ought from an is. There's also a question of how far we actually would want our societies to be modeled on ecosystems. I mean, it's great that there's no hierarchy, but this food web that Bookchin describes is one in which predators eat prey, and in particular, the prey animals that get eaten tend to be the ones that are sick or weak. Do we really want to build a society in which everything is structured non-hierarchically except the sick and the weak get eaten, as it were? So I think there are some really interesting questions to ask about how the theory of social ecology finds its way into practice and how the theory of social ecology is grounded. But I think Bookchin lays out a very ambitious program that gives us a lot to think about.